The banker's words fell like hammer blows on an anvil, each one driving deeper into Florence Morgan's chest as she stood in the dusty office on that sweltering August afternoon in 1878. Mrs. Morgan, your husband accumulated $17,000 in gambling debts before his passing, and the ranch is collateral for most of it. Florence felt the room tilt slightly, her gloved hands gripping the edge of the mahogany desk. 3 weeks had passed since they buried Thomas, 3 weeks since the fever took him, and now she discovered he had left her worse than widowed. The small cattle ranch outside Fort Kearny, Nebraska, the one she had poured her soul into for 5 years, belonged to men whose names she did not even know. Men who played cards and smoke-filled rooms while she scrubbed floors and mended fences and believed her husband was building them a future. "How long do I have?" Her voice came out steadier than she felt. The banker, a portly man named Hutchins with sweat beading on his upper lip, shifted uncomfortably. "The creditors are being somewhat generous, Mrs. Morgan. They have given you 60 days to settle the debt or vacate the property." "I am sorry. Truly I am." Florence walked out of that bank into the blazing Nebraska sun with her head held high, though her heart felt like shattered glass. She was 24 years old, alone in a territory where women without means or protection were as vulnerable as newborn calves in winter. The walk back to her wagon seemed endless, the main street of Fort Kearny stretching before her like a gauntlet of curious stares and pitying glances. News traveled fast in small towns. She climbed onto the wagon seat, taking up the reins with hands that trembled only slightly. The 2 horses, Buck and Darcy, were among the few things not mentioned in Thomas's debts, probably because they were so old no one wanted them. As she guided them toward the edge of town, a voice called out, "Mrs. Morgan, hold up there." Florence turned to see a tall man approaching, leading a paint horse. She recognized him vaguely, one of the ranch hands who worked the larger spreads north of town. He was perhaps 27 or 28, with sun-darkened skin and eyes the color of winter sky. His hat was pushed back, revealing dark hair that needed cutting, and he moved with the easy confidence of a man comfortable in his own skin. "Madam, I am Quinn Barrett. I worked your husband's ranch about 2 years back, before he let most of the hands go." He stopped a respectful distance from her wagon. "I heard in town about your situation. I wanted to offer my help." Florence felt heat rise in her cheeks, shame burning through her like wildfire. "I appreciate the offer, Mr. Barrett, but I have no money to pay ranch hands." "I have no money for anything, as it turns out." Quinn looked up at her, and she saw no pity in his expression, only a straightforward honesty that was somehow more unsettling than sympathy. "I was not asking for money, madam. I have a proposition if you will hear me out." Every instinct told her to refuse, to drive away and salvage what little dignity she had left. But desperation made people do things they never imagined, so she nodded. "Speak your piece. Your land is good grazing land, some of the best in this county. The house and barn need work, but the bones are solid. What you lack is cattle and capital." He paused, measuring his words. "I have been saving my wages for 6 years now. I have enough to buy a starter herd, maybe 40 head. I propose we become partners. I provide the cattle and the labor, you provide the land. We split the profits when we sell, 60-40, with the larger share going to you since it is your property." Florence stared at him, searching for the trap, the angle, the thing that would cost her even more than she had already lost. "Why would you do this? You could lease land anywhere." "Because leasing land means building someone else's dream," Quinn said simply. "This way, if we make it work, I earn a stake in something real, and you keep your home. I have 60 days before the bank takes it anyway." Then we have 60 days to make enough money to convince them you are good for it. His jaw set in a determined line. I have done the mathematics, Mrs. Morgan. If we work hard and catch a fair price at market, we can make a dent in that debt large enough to buy you time. Maybe not pay it all, but enough to show good faith. Florence felt something stir inside her, something she thought had died in that banker's office. It was not hope exactly, more like the ember that refuses to go completely cold. Mr. Barrett, I will not lie to you. My husband clearly had no head for business, and I am not certain I do either. What I have is a strong back and a stubborn streak. If you are willing to risk your savings on that, then I accept your partnership. Quinn smiled then, a real smile that reached his eyes and made him look younger. Strong backs and stubborn streaks built this territory, madam. I reckon they can save one ranch. They shook hands there in the dusty street, and Florence felt the calluses on his palm, the firm grip of a man who meant what he said. As she drove back to the ranch with Quinn riding alongside, she wondered if she had just made the wisest decision of her life or the most foolish. Time would tell, and time was the one thing she had precious little of. The ranch looked different when she arrived home, though nothing physical had changed. The weathered barn still leaned slightly to the left, the fence posts still needed replacing in 3 different sections, and the house still bore the marks of years of deferred maintenance. But now, instead of seeing insurmountable problems, Florence began to see possibilities. Quinn dismounted and walked the property with the practiced eye of a man who understood land and livestock. Florence followed, listening as he talked through his plans. We will need to repair these fences first. No point bringing cattle onto property they can wander off of. Then we will need to clear the south pasture of those brambles, give them more grazing room. He pointed toward the barn. That roof will not survive the winter storms. We should patch it before the snow comes. That is a lot of work for 2 people, Florence said, calculating the hours in her head. It is, Quinn agreed, but I know a few men who might work for the promise of wages once we sell. Good men who have been down on their luck and understand what it means to need a chance. Over the next 3 days, Quinn proved himself a man of action rather than empty words. He arrived each morning before dawn and worked until darkness made it impossible to continue. He brought with him 2 other ranch hands, Mexicans named Carlos and Miguel, who had been blacklisted from the larger ranches for organizing a work stoppage over dangerous conditions. They were skilled cowboys who asked only for meals and the promise of fair payment when the cattle sold. Florence worked alongside them, her hands blistering and then callousing as she hammered fence posts and cleared brush. Quinn never treated her as less capable, never suggested she should stay in the house doing woman's work. When she struggled with a particularly stubborn post, he showed her a better technique rather than taking over. When she successfully mended a section of fence that had seemed impossible, he nodded his approval with the same respect he showed Carlos and Miguel. On the 4th day, Quinn rode out before dawn and returned near sunset with a sight that made Florence's breath catch. 40 head of cattle, a mixed herd of longhorns and shorethorns, moving across her land like a living promise. They were not prime stock, mostly young steers and a few cows that the larger ranches considered too small to bother with, but to Florence, they represented something more valuable than gold. They represented a future. They are beautiful, she said, and meant it. Quinn sat on his horse beside her, watching the cattle spread across the south pasture. They are a gamble, he corrected gently, but sometimes the best things in life are. That night, after Carlos and Miguel had ridden back to the small camp they maintained on the edge of the property, Florence invited Quinn to stay for supper. It was the first time they had shared a meal, though they had worked side by side for days. She made a simple stew from vegetables and salt pork, nothing fancy, but Quinn ate it like it was a feast. "You did not have to do this," Florence said, breaking the comfortable silence. "Take on a partnership with a widow you barely know. Risk your savings on a property that might be seized in 2 months. Why did you really do it?" Quinn set down his spoon and met her eyes across the rough wooden table. "2 years ago, when I worked here briefly, I saw something that stuck with me. Your husband was in town, probably at the saloon, though I did not know that then. You were out in the south pasture, alone, trying to pull a calf that was breech. It was dangerous work, the kind that can get a person killed if the cow decides to defend itself or if things go wrong. But you did not quit. I watched you work for 2 hours until you got that calf delivered safe. Then you sat down in the dirt next to them and cried, just for a minute, before standing up and going back to work." Florence remembered that day, remembered the exhaustion and the fear and the overwhelming sense of doing everything alone. "That is when I knew you were someone worth believing in," Quinn continued. "Someone who does not quit, even when quitting would be easier. The rest of it, the partnership and the cattle, that is just good business sense. But the reason I offered, that is because I saw who you really are." Something shifted between them in that moment, something neither of them spoke aloud but both felt as surely as the summer heat. Florence looked at this man who had appeared in her life at its lowest point and saw not a savior, not someone offering charity, but a partner who believed in her capability when she had stopped believing in herself. The next morning, they discovered the first real test of their partnership. 3 of the cattle had pushed through a weak section of fence during the night and wandered onto the neighboring property belonging to a rancher named Sutton, a hard man with a reputation for shooting first and asking questions later about strays on his land. "I will go," Florence said immediately, already reaching for her hat. "We will go together," Quinn corrected. "Those are our cattle, not yours or mine. Ours." They rode to Sutton's ranch, finding the old rancher on his porch with a rifle across his knees and their 3 cattle penned in his corral. He was a weathered man in his 60s with eyes like flint and a mouth set in a permanent scowl. "Figured someone would come looking for these," Sutton said, not rising from his chair. "Going to cost you $10 to get them back. Trespassing fee." "Mr. Sutton, those cattle broke through a weak section of fence we had not yet repaired," Florence said, keeping her voice steady. "We are willing to make amends, but $10 is more than those steers are worth." "Then leave them here and I will consider the debt paid," Sutton said with a shrug. Quinn stepped forward, his hand resting casually on his belt, nowhere near his gun but in a posture that suggested he could move quickly if needed. "Or we could discuss this like reasonable neighbors. We will pay you $2 for your trouble and ensure the fence is repaired so it does not happen again. That is fair compensation for cattle that did no damage to your property." Sutton's eyes narrowed, sizing up Quinn like a man evaluating livestock. Whatever he saw, there made him reconsider. $5, and you repair that fence today. $3, and we repair it before sundown, Quinn countered. They settled on $3.50, and Florence felt a reluctant respect for both men. Sutton for being willing to negotiate despite his bluster, and Quinn for handling the situation without violence or submission. As they drove the cattle back across the property line, Sutton called out one more time, "Mrs. Morgan, you picked a good partner there. Better than the last one, I would wager." The words stung because they were true, but Florence nodded her acknowledgement. As they rode back, Quinn glanced at her. "You all right? People are going to talk," Florence said quietly. "A widow and an unmarried man working a ranch together. In a town this size, tongues will wag. Let them. Quinn said with a firmness that surprised her. People who have never struggled a day in their lives love to judge those who have. Their opinions do not pay debts or mend fences, our work does. But the talk did come, as Florence knew it would. The next week, when she went into town for supplies, she felt the stares, heard the whispers that cut off when she approached. Mrs. Hutchins, the banker's wife, actually crossed the street to avoid passing too close to her. Only the shopkeeper, an older woman named Mrs. Chen, who had come from California during the gold rush, treated her the same as always. "Do not let them shame you," Mrs. Chen said as she wrapped Florence's purchases. "I have seen women in this town starve rather than do what was necessary to survive because they were afraid of wagging tongues. You are doing honest work to save your home. There is no shame in that." Florence felt tears prick her eyes but refused to let them fall. "Thank you. That young man you partnered with, Quinn Barrett, he has a good reputation. Works hard, does not drink or gamble, sends money back to his mother in Kansas. People talk because they have nothing better to do, but they know in their hearts you did nothing wrong." Those words sustained Florence through the next weeks as summer blazed into early September. The work was relentless, each day bringing new challenges. A calf took sick and required round-the-clock care. A section of the barn roof collapsed during a sudden storm, soaking half their winter hay stores. One of the steers broke its leg and had to be slaughtered. The meat salted and preserved so the loss was not total. Through it all, Quinn remained steady. He taught Florence things her husband never had: practical knowledge about cattle and horses, about reading weather signs and managing grazing rotation. In return, she shared her knowledge of the land itself, the quirks of the creek that ran through the property, the best places to find wild herbs for medicine, the way the wind shifted before storms. They fell into a rhythm, a partnership that felt as natural as breathing. Quinn still maintained his own small room in the barn, preserving propriety, but they shared meals and conversation in the evenings. Florence learned that he had grown up on a small farm in Kansas, the youngest of 5 children. His father had died when Quinn was 14, and he had been working ever since, sending money home to help his mother and sisters. "Why did you never start your own ranch before now?" Florence asked one evening as they sat on the porch, too exhausted to do anything but watch the sun set. "Fear, mostly," Quinn admitted. "Fear of failing, of losing everything I worked for, but I turned 28 last month and I realized that playing it safe meant never having anything worth losing. Sometimes you have to risk everything to gain something real. Is that what this is to you?" Florence asked. "A risk worth taking." Quinn turned to look at her, and in the fading light his eyes were serious. "This partnership, this ranch, working with you, it is the first time in my life I have felt like I am building something that matters. So yes, it is worth every risk." Florence felt her heart beat faster, felt the air between them charge with something unnamed. She stood quickly, suddenly afraid of what she might say or do. "I should get some rest. Tomorrow we need to move the herd to the east pasture." If Quinn was disappointed by her retreat, he did not show it. "Good night, Florence." It was the first time he had used her given name, and it followed her into the house, into her dreams. The deadline approached like a storm on the horizon, impossible to avoid. With 2 weeks left before the 60 days expired, they drove the cattle to market in Omaha, a 3-day journey that left them all exhausted and sore. Carlos and Miguel came along to help, and Florence insisted on going as well, despite Quinn's initial objection. "This is my ranch and my debt," she said firmly. "I will see it through to the end, whatever that end may be." The cattle market was chaos, hundreds of animals and dozens of buyers shouting prices and making deals. Quinn proved himself a skilled negotiator, playing buyers against each other until he secured a price that made Florence's eyes widen. When the final tally was counted, they had made $947. It was not enough to pay the full debt, not even close. But it was enough to show good faith, enough to prove the ranch could be profitable. They paid Carlos and Miguel their wages, fair payment that made both men shake Quinn's hand with genuine respect. Then they began the long journey back to Fort Kearny. "What will you say to the banker?" Quinn asked as they camped the first night, sitting around a small fire under a sky full of stars. "The truth," Florence said, "that I have made a payment of $700, that I have a working ranch with a profitable herd, and that I intend to pay every cent owed, but I need more time." "And if he says no?" Florence stared into the fire, watching the flames dance. "Then I have at least tried. I have worked harder these past 2 months than I ever have in my life. I have built something with my own hands with your help. Even if I lose the ranch, no one can take that away from me. The knowledge that I did not just give up, that I fought for what was mine." Quinn was quiet for a long moment. "You are an extraordinary woman, Florence Morgan." She looked at him across the fire, this man who had changed her life in ways she was only beginning to understand. "You gave me a chance when no one else would. You treated me like a capable partner instead of a helpless widow. That makes you pretty extraordinary too, Quinn Barrett." When they arrived back at the ranch the next evening, they found the house had been vandalized. Windows broken, furniture overturned, the word whore painted in crude red letters across the front door. Florence stood staring at the destruction, rage and grief warring inside her. "Who would do this?" she whispered. Quinn's jaw was tight with anger. "Cowards who destroy things under cover of darkness, because they are too weak to face people in daylight." They spent the evening cleaning up, boarding over the broken windows until they could afford glass replacements. Florence scrubbed at the paint on the door until her arms ached, until finally Quinn gently took the brush from her hands. "Let me," he said softly. Florence sank down on the porch steps, suddenly overwhelmed by everything. The exhaustion of the journey, the upcoming meeting with the banker, the hatred that had driven someone to attack her home. She felt tears start to fall and could not stop them. Quinn sat beside her, not touching, just present. "I am sorry this happened. I thought if I worked hard enough, if I did everything right, it would be enough," Florence said through her tears. "But it does not matter what I do. To some people, I will always be the woman who is doing something shameful just by trying to survive." "You have done nothing shameful," Quinn said with quiet intensity. "Not one single thing. Those people who judge you, who destroyed your property, they are afraid. Afraid that if a woman can survive on her own, can build something without a husband, it makes their own lives and choices look small. Your strength threatens them, so they try to tear you down." Florence looked at him, seeing the conviction in his eyes. "You really believe that?" "I know it." Quinn reached out and gently wiped a tear from her cheek with his thumb. "You are the strongest person I have ever met. What you have accomplished in 2 months, rebuilding not just a ranch but your whole life. Most people could not do that in a lifetime." The touch of his hand on her face sent warmth through Florence, chasing away some of the cold that had settled in her chest. She leaned into his touch without thinking, and Quinn's hand moved to cup her cheek. They sat frozen like that for a heartbeat, then another, the air between them electric with possibility. "Florence," Quinn said, his voice rough, "I need you to know that I have cared about you from the beginning. Not just as a business partner. These past 2 months, working beside you, watching you refuse to give up no matter what got thrown at you, I have fallen in love with you. I know the timing is terrible, and I know you might not feel the same way, but I could not let another day pass without telling you the truth." Florence felt her breath catch. Part of her wanted to pull away, to protect herself from the possibility of more pain. She had trusted Thomas, had believed in their future, and he had left her with nothing but debt and broken dreams. But Quinn was not Thomas. Quinn had proven himself day after day with actions rather than words, with partnership rather than promises. "I am afraid," she whispered. "Afraid of needing someone again, of trusting someone again." "I know," Quinn said, "and I am not asking you to need me. I am offering to stand beside you as your partner, as someone who loves you for exactly who you are, strong, stubborn, capable you. If all you ever want is a business partner, I will accept that and be grateful for it. But I had to tell you the truth." Florence looked into his eyes and saw sincerity, saw patience, saw a man willing to wait for her to be ready. And she realized that she had been falling in love with him too, slowly, over weeks of shared work and conversation and mutual respect. This was not the wild passion of her youth when she married Thomas. This was something deeper, something built on a foundation of trust and understanding. "I am afraid," she said again, "but I am also falling in love with you, and that terrifies me more than losing the ranch, more than anything." Quinn smiled, slow and sweet. "Then we will be afraid together." He leaned forward, giving her time to pull away, but Florence met him halfway. Their first kiss was gentle, tentative, tasting of salt from her tears and hope for the future. When they finally pulled apart, Florence felt something shift inside her, like a locked door finally opening. The next morning they rode into Fort Kearny together, united in purpose. In the banker's office, Florence laid out $700 in cash and her proposal for payment of the remaining debt. Hutchins listened, his expression unreadable. When she finished, he leaned back in his chair with a heavy sigh. "Mrs. Morgan, I appreciate your efforts, truly I do. But $700 is a far cry from $17,000. The creditors are already losing patience." "Then tell them they can have their patience back when I have their money," Florence said firmly. "I have proven the ranch is viable. I have a partner who brought capital and livestock. We made a profit in our first season, and we will make more. This is not a charity case or a hopeless cause. This is a working ranch with a solid business plan. The creditors want their money now." "The creditors want blood," Quinn said, speaking for the first time. "They want to seize the property and sell it at auction, make back their money plus profit. But if they force that sale, Mrs. Morgan will declare bankruptcy, and they will have to fight over scraps in court for years. Or they can accept payments, get their money back over time with interest, and everyone comes out ahead." Hutchins looked at Quinn with new assessment. "You seem to know a lot about this." "I worked for a bank in Kansas City before I came west," Quinn said. "I know how these things work. I also know that creditors would rather have a sure thing over time than a risky auction. Offer them terms. $700 now, plus $100 a month until the debt is paid. At that rate, with interest, they will have their money back in 4 years, maybe less if we have good seasons." The banker drummed his fingers on the desk, calculating. "I will have to present this to the creditors. It is not my decision alone." "When will you know?" Florence asked. "Come back in 3 days." Those 3 days were the longest of Florence's life. She and Quinn threw themselves into work, repairing the vandalism damage, preparing for the coming autumn. They did not speak much about what would happen if the answer was no, but the possibility hung between them like storm clouds. On the 3rd day, they returned to town. Hutchins gestured them into his office with an expression Florence could not read. Her heart pounded so hard she thought it might break through her ribs. "The creditors have accepted your terms," Hutchins said, and Florence felt the room spin. $700 down, $100 a month, with 6% interest on the remaining balance. You will sign a promissory note, and if you miss 2 consecutive payments, the property will be seized immediately. Are these terms acceptable? Yes, Florence said, her voice barely a whisper. Yes, they are acceptable. The paperwork seemed to take forever, but finally it was done. Florence walked out of that bank a free woman, or at least as free as someone with years of debt payments ahead could be. But she had her ranch, her home, her future. Quinn was waiting on the street, and when she emerged, he searched her face for the answer. Florence smiled, a real smile that felt like sunshine breaking through clouds. "We did it," she said. "The ranch is ours." Quinn swept her up in his arms, spinning her around right there on Main Street in front of God and everyone. When he set her down, he kissed her, and Florence kissed him back without caring who saw or what they thought. Let them talk. She had fought for her home and won. The weeks that followed were filled with preparation for winter. They bought more cattle with Quinn's remaining savings, building the herd to 70 head. Carlos and Miguel agreed to stay on as permanent hands in exchange for wages and housing. The 4 of them worked from dawn to dusk, building up hay stores, reinforcing the barn, preparing for Nebraska's brutal winters. In mid-October, as the leaves turned gold and red, Quinn asked Florence to marry him. They were standing in the east pasture, watching the cattle graze in the slanting afternoon light, and he simply turned to her and said, "Florence Morgan, will you be my wife?" Florence looked at this man who had given her back her life, who had loved her without trying to save or change her, who had treated her as an equal partner in every way. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I will marry you." They were wed in early November by the circuit preacher, a simple ceremony at the ranch with Carlos and Miguel as witnesses. Florence wore a simple blue dress, and Quinn wore his best shirt and a nervous smile. Mrs. Chen came from town, bringing a cake and her blessing. Even a few of the neighboring ranchers attended, including old Sutton, who gruffly wished them well. That night in the house that was now truly theirs, Quinn carried Florence over the threshold. They made love slowly, tenderly, learning each other's bodies with patience and care. Afterward, lying in each other's arms, Florence felt a peace she had never known. "I love you," she whispered into the darkness. "I love you too," Quinn replied. "My partner, my wife, my home." The winter was hard, as Nebraska winters always were. Blizzards swept across the plains, and they lost 3 cattle to cold and 1 to wolves. But they endured, the 4 of them working together to keep the herd alive, to keep themselves alive. Quinn proved himself a patient teacher, showing Carlos and Miguel better techniques, never lording his knowledge over them. In return, they taught him Mexican vaquero tricks, ways of handling cattle and horses that he had never learned. By spring, when the snows melted and green grass returned, they were ready. The cattle had survived, and Florence discovered she was pregnant. She told Quinn on a warm May morning, and he picked her up and spun her around just as he had the day they saved the ranch. "We are going to have a baby," he said, wonder in his voice. "We are going to have a family," Florence corrected, looking out at the ranch, at Carlos and Miguel repairing fence in the distance, at the cattle grazing peacefully. "We already do." Their son was born in January of 1880, a healthy boy they named Thomas Quinn Barrett, honoring both the past and the future. Florence held him and felt not the pain of her first husband's betrayals, but gratitude for the journey that had brought her here. Thomas's mistakes had been his own, but they had led her to Quinn, to this life, to this moment. The years that followed were not easy. Ranching never was. They endured droughts and hard winters, years when cattle prices dropped and they barely made their payments. But they endured together, building not just a ranch but a real home. Carlos met a woman in town and married, bringing her to live in the little house they built on the property. Miguel saved enough to buy his own small spread nearby, becoming their closest neighbor and friend. Florence had 3 more children, a daughter named Charlotte in 1882, and twin boys named James and Henry in 1884. The house rang with laughter and the chaos of family life. Quinn proved himself a devoted father, patient and playful, teaching his children to ride and rope and respect the land. By 1890, they had paid off the debt completely, 12 years of steady payments that finally freed them from the shadow of Thomas's mistakes. Florence was 36 years old, Quinn 39, and they stood on the porch of their ranch watching their children play in the yard. "Do you ever regret it?" Florence asked, leaning into Quinn's side. "Taking such a risk on me." Quinn wrapped his arm around her, pulling her close. "Not even for a moment. You were never a risk, Florence. You were the surest thing I ever bet on." Florence looked out at the ranch, at the home they had built from ruins and debt and hard work. She thought about that terrible day in the banker's office, when she thought her life was over. She had not known then that it was actually just beginning, that sometimes you have to lose everything to find what really matters. "I love you," she said, as she had said 1,000 times before, and would say 1,000 times again. "I love you too," Quinn replied, kissing the top of her head. "My partner, my wife, my home." The sun set over the Nebraska plains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, and Florence Morgan Barrett felt complete. She had been left with nothing but debt and despair, and from that nothing she had built everything that mattered. Not because someone saved her, but because someone believed in her enough to stand beside her while she saved herself. The ranch continued to thrive over the following years, becoming one of the most respected operations in the county. Their children grew strong and capable, learning the value of hard work and perseverance from parents who embodied those qualities. Thomas Quinn, the eldest, showed a natural aptitude for working with horses and took over much of the breeding program by the time he was 16. Charlotte proved to have her mother's head for numbers and managed the ranch's books and accounts. The twins, James and Henry, were inseparable partners who handled the cattle operations with skill beyond their years. In 1895, when Florence was 41 and Quinn was 45, they expanded the ranch again, purchasing the adjacent property from a widow who wanted to move east to be with her daughter. It felt right somehow, Florence helping another woman in difficult circumstances, though this time with money rather than just moral support. The additional land allowed them to increase their herd to over 300 head, making them one of the larger operations in the region. Carlos and his wife Maria had 4 children of their own, and the two families grew up intertwined, the children playing together and learning from each other. Miguel married late, at 43, to a widow with 2 nearly grown children, and his ranch prospered as well. On summer evenings, the 3 families would gather for meals that stretched late into the night, filled with laughter and storytelling and the deep bonds of people who had struggled and succeeded together. The town's attitude toward Florence shifted over the years, as success and time have a way of changing people's minds. The same women who had whispered about her in 1878 now sought her advice about managing household finances and dealing with difficult circumstances. Florence was gracious, but never forgot who had stood by her and who had not. Mrs. Chen remained a dear friend until her death in 1897, and Florence wept at her funeral, remembering the kindness shown when kindness was rare. In 1900, as a new century dawned, Florence and Quinn sat on that same porch where they had shared so many evenings, now weathered and worn but still solid. Their children were grown or nearly so, making their own ways in the world. Thomas Quinn had married a schoolteacher from Omaha, and was building a house on the northern section of the ranch. Charlotte was courting a lawyer from town, a good man who respected her intelligence and independence. The twins were still at home, not yet ready to settle down, full of energy and plans for expanding the ranch further. 22 years, Florence said, reaching over to take Quinn's hand. Sometimes it feels like yesterday we were standing in that banker's office, and sometimes it feels like a lifetime ago. It was a lifetime ago, Quinn said, threading his fingers through hers. We were different people then, desperate, scared, unsure. You were never scared. I was terrified, Quinn admitted with a laugh. I had just risked every cent I owned on a partnership with a woman I barely knew in an endeavor that had a high chance of failure. I was absolutely terrified. You never showed it, because you needed someone to be strong. And then I discovered you were stronger than I ever was. You just needed someone to believe in you so you could remember that strength yourself. Florence squeezed his hand, feeling the familiar calluses, the slight stiffness that came with age and decades of hard work. We made a good team. The best, Quinn agreed. Though I have to say, I expected the partnership to be strictly business when I first proposed it. Falling in love with you was not part of the plan. Oh, really? Florence said with mock indignation. And when did you realize you loved me? Quinn was quiet for a moment, genuinely thinking back. That day we went to Sutton's ranch to get the stray cattle. Watching you stand up to that ornery old man, negotiating with him instead of just accepting his terms or backing down. You were magnificent. That was when I knew I was in trouble. And yet you waited weeks to tell me. I was waiting for the right moment. And then someone vandalized the house, and you were crying on the porch, and I could not keep it inside anymore. Not the most romantic confession of love. It was perfect, Florence said softly. It was exactly what I needed to hear, exactly when I needed to hear it. You gave me hope when I had none left. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sun set over land they had fought for and won. In the distance, they could see their cattle grazing, their children and hired hands moving about their evening tasks, the life they had built from nothing but determination and partnership. You think the children understand? Quinn asked. What we went through to build this? Thomas Quinn does, I think. He was old enough to remember some of it, and we have told them the story. But really understanding, that only comes from going through something similar yourself. I hope they never have to face what we did, but I also hope they develop the strength to overcome it if they do. They will, Quinn said with confidence. They have you as their mother. That alone guarantees they will be strong enough to face whatever comes. Florence leaned her head on Quinn's shoulder, feeling the solid warmth of him, the steady presence that had been her anchor for over 2 decades. I never thanked you properly, you know, for saving me. I did not save you, Quinn said firmly, a conversation they had had many times over the years, but that never seemed to quite settle. You saved yourself. I just gave you the tools to do it. You gave me more than tools. You gave me partnership when the world said a woman could not be a partner. You gave me respect when people offered only pity or scorn. You gave me love when I thought I would never trust anyone again. That is not nothing, Quinn Barrett. Quinn kissed the top of her head, a gesture so familiar and comforting that Florence felt tears prick her eyes. You gave me a home, Florence. Not just this ranch, though it is beautiful, but a real home with love and family and purpose. Before you, I was just a hired hand drifting from job to job, saving money for a someday that never seemed to come. You made someday into today. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, one by one, Florence reflected on the journey that had brought them here. She thought about that terrified, shamed widow standing in a banker's office, certain her life was over. She thought about the cowboy who had offered partnership without pity, who had seen her strength when she could not see it herself. She thought about the years of backbreaking work, the small victories and setbacks, the slow building of not just a ranch but a life worth living. "If you could go back," Florence said slowly, "back to that day in 1878, knowing everything that would come after, all the hard times and struggles, would you still make the same choice?" Quinn did not hesitate. "Every single time. Would you?" Florence thought about Thomas, about the pain of discovering his betrayals, about standing in that dusty street accepting help from a stranger because she had no other choice. She thought about the shame and the fear and the exhaustion. And then she thought about everything that came after. The partnership that became love, the family they built, the respect they earned, the life they created from ruins. "Every single time," she echoed, "because it brought me here to this moment with you." They sat together as night fell completely, the sounds of the ranch settling around them like a familiar lullaby. Inside the house, they could hear Charlotte setting the table for supper, calling for her brothers. From the bunkhouse, someone was playing a guitar and Carlos's children were laughing about something. It was an ordinary evening on an ordinary ranch in Nebraska, and it was everything Florence had ever wanted. The years continued their steady march forward. Florence and Quinn grew older together, their hair turning gray, their bodies showing the signs of decades of hard work. But their love never diminished, never became routine or taken for granted. They had built their relationship on respect and partnership, and those foundations proved unshakable. In 1910, they celebrated their 30th wedding anniversary with a party that brought people from all over the county. Their children arranged everything, insisting their parents do nothing but show up and enjoy themselves. It was a beautiful autumn day, warm for November, and the ranch was filled with friends and family, with music and laughter and abundant food. Old Sutton was there, ancient now but still cantankerous, telling anyone who would listen about the time Florence and Quinn had negotiated him down on a trespassing fee, and how he knew right then they would make something of themselves. The current banker, young Mr. Hutchins, who had taken over from his father, toasted them as the model of what hard work and determination could accomplish. Even some of the women who had shunned Florence in those early days came, their earlier cruelty conveniently forgotten, and Florence welcomed them with grace if not warmth. As the sun set and the party continued, Florence and Quinn slipped away for a quiet moment alone, walking out to the east pasture where Quinn had proposed all those years ago. The land looked different now, well-tended and prosperous, but the rolling hills and endless sky were the same. 30 years, Florence said, shaking her head in wonder. "How did we get so lucky?" "Luck had nothing to do with it," Quinn said, pulling her close. "We worked for every bit of this. We earned it. We did not we?" Florence smiled, looking back toward the house where their children and grandchildren were celebrating. "We really did. Any regrets?" Quinn asked. Florence pretended to think about it, then shook her head. "Not a single one. You. Only that I did not meet you sooner. But then again, maybe we both needed to become who we were before we were ready for each other." "That is awfully philosophical for a cowboy," Florence teased. "I am a rancher, thank you very much, and a husband and a father and a grandfather, but yes, I suppose I will always be a cowboy at heart." He paused, then added softly, "Your cowboy." "My cowboy," Florence agreed, rising on her toes to kiss him. "My partner, my love, my home." They returned to the party hand in hand, and the celebration continued late into the night. But Florence would always remember that quiet moment in the pasture, just the two of them and the land they had saved, kept, and nurtured. It was the culmination of everything they had fought for, everything they had built together. Florence Morgan Barrett lived to the age of 73, passing peacefully in her sleep in 1927 with Quinn holding her hand. She had lived to see her children raise families of their own, to meet a dozen grandchildren and 3 great-grandchildren. She had seen the ranch continue to prosper and expand, becoming a legacy that would endure for generations. Most importantly, she had lived a life of purpose and love, transforming the disaster of 1878 into a triumph that lasted nearly 50 years. Quinn lived for 2 more years after Florence's death, cared for by his children, but never quite the same without his partner by his side. When he passed in 1929 at the age of 79, his children buried him next to Florence on a hill overlooking the ranch, with a simple stone that read, Quinn Barrett, 1850–1929. He believed in her when no one else would. The ranch stayed in the family for 3 more generations before eventually being sold in the 1980s, but the story of Florence and Quinn lived on. It became part of local legend, the tale of the widow left with nothing but debt, and the cowboy who helped her start over without shame. It was a story about partnership and perseverance, about love built on respect rather than rescue, about 2 people who refused to give up even when the world expected them to fail. And in the end, that was the greatest legacy they left behind. Not the land or the cattle or the money, though those things mattered, but the example they set, the proof that one person believing in another can change everything, that shame has no place in honest work, and that love founded on equality and respect can weather any storm. They had taken nothing and built everything, and their story became a testament to what is possible when 2 people decide to face the world together, as true partners in every sense of the word.